Dying in secret was a deliberate choice, and she made it for months, possibly years. The woman who spent 4 decades on television drawing confessions out of strangers kept her own diagnosis entirely hidden. Metastatic bone cancer. 65 years old. 19 words in an official statement, and not one of them revealed what was truly unfolding inside this family. Because the silence surrounding how she died is not even the most significant silence in this story. There is a son who discovered his mother was gone through a news feed. A private jet purchased with pandemic relief money. A non-disclosure agreement deployed as a weapon within her own family. How does a woman who preached redemption to 2.3 billion households fail to achieve it in her own? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. The official statement was 19 words long. Daystar Television Network, the 2.3 billion household Christian broadcasting empire that Joni Lamb spent 4 decades constructing, announced her death on May 7, 2026, with the kind of institutional brevity that generates more questions than it resolves. She had been, the statement said, managing serious health issues privately. No diagnosis, no timeline, no medical details of any kind. For a network that had built its entire identity on radical transparency, on confession, on vulnerability, on the conviction that sharing your suffering was itself an act of faith, the silence was conspicuous. It took Wikipedia. It took secondary reporting. It took sources entirely beyond Daystar's reach to name what actually killed Joni Lamb. Metastatic bone cancer. She was 65 years old. Born July 19, 1960, in Colleyville, Texas. Died May 7, 2026, in Bedford, Texas, the same North Texas corridor where she had built everything she ever had. Here is what the medical record, reconstructed from available sources, actually tells us. Metastatic bone cancer is not a primary cancer. The word metastatic means it originated somewhere else, another organ, another system, and then spread into the bones. By the time cancer has reached the skeletal structure, it has typically been developing in the body for a considerable period. It is a late-stage designation. It is not a diagnosis that arrives without forewarning. What that tells us medically is this. Joni Lamb almost certainly knew she was gravely ill long before the public did. The question of exactly how long, months, or something closer to years, remains unanswered, because Daystar chose not to answer it. What Daystar did eventually say, through carefully selected language, was that a back injury had complicated her existing condition, that a spinal event, a physical trauma to the back, had taken what was already a serious medical situation and made it acutely worse. The injury accelerated a deterioration that may have been managed, however tenuously, up to that point. The final days came quickly after that. She spent them at home in Bedford, Texas, not in a hospital, not in a care facility. At home, which, for someone who understood the power of narrative as deeply as Joni Lamb did, feels less like a circumstance and more like a conscious decision. And here is what no one at Daystar has directly confronted. The gap between what she knew and what she told the people who watched her every week. For 4 decades, Joni Table Talk was built on a specific promise. Sit down, be honest, share what you are carrying. The show's entire moral foundation rested on the idea that concealing your pain was the enemy of healing. Joni had sat across from celebrities, ministers, survivors, and ordinary people and drawn out of them the very things they were most afraid to say. She never extended that same invitation to herself. Not about this. Does that make her a hypocrite? Or does it make her human? Someone capable of holding space for other people's vulnerability while being fundamentally unable to offer her own? That is not a question with a tidy answer. But it is one worth sitting with. What we know is this. The woman who told the world that faith demanded openness kept the most consequential fact of her final chapter entirely private. And the network she built, staffed by people who knew or must have known, held that silence until there was nothing left to protect. Joni Lamb died of metastatic bone cancer complicated by a back injury on May 7, 2026. That is the confirmed fact. Everything Daystar chose not to say around that fact is a story unto itself. Here is a number that stops people cold. $40 million. That is the estimated net worth Joni Lamb carried to her grave, the accumulated result of 4 decades spent at the intersection of faith and television, of gospel and real estate, of ministry and money. $40 million built on donations, on airtime, on the sacred trust of viewers who watched Joni Table Talk and believed they were funding the kingdom of God. And here is the first thing you need to understand about that number. It is an estimate, because Daystar Television Network is registered as a church. And churches, under United States federal law, are not required to disclose their finances to anyone. Not to the government, not to their donors, not to you. So what do we actually know? Follow the property records, because those are public. And what they reveal is a portrait of prosperity that would give most Americans pause. 7 luxury properties. Documented. The centerpiece. A mansion in Colleyville, Texas, spanning 7,300 square feet, valued at $2.9 million. This is not a modest home for a woman of faith. This is an estate. It sits in the same North Texas corridor where Joni was born, where she built her network, where she buried her first husband. A geography of everything she ever constructed or lost. Then there is the Gulf Front condominium in Miramar Beach, Florida. $3.9 million, purchased with her second husband, Doug Weiss, following their marriage in June 2023. Floor-to-ceiling water views. The kind of retreat that whispers not of sacrifice, but of arrival. Additional properties in Georgia and South Carolina. Others still being tracked by financial journalists who keep running into the same obstacle. The church exemption, the legal silence, the institutional barrier that shields Daystar's books from outside examination. $11.7 million in documented real estate alone. And that is only what the records show. But the property story, striking as it is not the sharpest edge of this financial picture. That edge belongs to a single transaction. One purchase. One line item in Daystar's pandemic-era finances that, when a television news magazine pulled it into the light, forced the network into a retreat so swift it bordered on a confession. During 2020, at the height of a global health crisis, Daystar Television Network applied for and received $3.9 million through the Paycheck Protection Program, a federal relief fund designed to help struggling businesses retain their employees. The money was taxpayer-funded. It was extended on the promise of workforce preservation. Daystar used it to purchase a private jet. A private jet that subsequent reporting confirmed the family used for personal travel, vacations, leisure flights, the ministry of getting somewhere warm. When Inside Edition broke the story, Daystar repaid the loan. The speed of that repayment was its own kind of answer. And here is the question that lingers, the one Joni Lamb never addressed publicly. What does it say about the foundation of a ministry when its first instinct, confronted with a crisis, is to upgrade its transportation? Joni built something undeniably real. Joni Table Talk ran for 4 decades. She co-hosted Ministry Now. She published books. She received the Best Television Talk Show Award from the National Religious Broadcasters in 2004. She carried Daystar into 2.3 billion households across the globe, a reach that surpasses most secular networks and virtually every other Christian broadcaster on the planet. That is not nothing. By any honest measure, it is extraordinary. But here is the tension that defined everything about Joni Lamb's public life, the unresolvable contradiction at the heart of her story. She preached sacrifice. She modeled abundance. She asked her viewers to give. And she lived in a manner that suggested she received far more than she ever disclosed. The financial arithmetic of her ministry was kept carefully, legally, institutionally hidden. She was not a fraud in the simple sense. The network is real. The reach is real. The faith of the millions who watched her every week was, and remains, entirely genuine. But $40 million does not accumulate in a vacuum. It accumulates within a structure, a legal, financial, and theological structure specifically engineered to make accountability optional. Joni Lamb built that structure. She benefited from it for 4 decades. And when she died, she took its full accounting with her. The empire remains. The books stay closed. And somewhere in a Gulf Front condominium in Miramar Beach, the numbers sit undisturbed, sheltered as always by the oldest exemption in American law. And now the question that changes everything about this story. If the finances were complicated, the family was catastrophic. What really happened inside the Lamb family, and how much of it can actually be proven? Every dynasty has a fault line. For the Lambs, It began with a confession and ended with a family so shattered that a son learned his mother had died not from a phone call, not from a family member, not from anyone who cared for him, but from the news. To understand how a family reaches that point, you have to go all the way back to the night Marcus Lamb sat in front of his own cameras and told the world he had been unfaithful. It was 2010. Marcus Lamb, co-founder of Daystar, husband, patriarch, the man whose name was on the building, appeared on his own network and admitted to an affair. He maintained the admission was not voluntary. He claimed 3 individuals had attempted to blackmail him into silence, and that he had chosen exposure over capitulation. Whether that framing reflected genuine courage or sophisticated damage control is a question only Marcus ever knew the answer to. What is not in question is what happened next. Joni sat beside him. Live television. Millions of viewers. The kind of moment that ends marriages. And she stayed. She looked into the camera and said the Holy Spirit had told her he was worth fighting for. Not that she forgave him. Not that she understood him. That she had received a divine instruction to remain. Consider what that moment required of her, to absorb a public humiliation so complete, so visible, so permanent, and to frame it not as an act of survival but as a calling. Joni Lamb transformed her husband's betrayal into a testimony, and the audience loved her for it. Marcus died 11 years later, on November 30, 2021. COVID-19. He was 64 years old. A man who had spent the final chapter of his public life as one of the most vocal opponents of the vaccines that might have saved him. He died of the very disease he had spent months downplaying. The irony was devastating. His family did not address it publicly. And Joni, who had stood by him through infidelity, through scrutiny, through 2 decades of building something enormous together, was now alone at the top of an empire. She did not remain alone for long. On June 10, 2023, 18 months after burying her husband, Joni Lamb married Doug Weiss, a therapist and sexual health counselor who had appeared on Daystar as a guest many times, a familiar presence within the network's ecosystem of faith-based healing. And here is where the fault line cracked open. Her son Jonathan objected. Not quietly, not privately. Jonathan Lamb, who had grown up inside Daystar, who had worked there, who had built his adult identity around the ministry his parents created, raised a theological challenge to the marriage. His argument was specific. Doug Weiss, he contended, did not have biblical grounds for his divorce from his previous wife. Under the doctrinal framework Daystar had preached for decades, the marriage was therefore illegitimate. This was not a minor objection. This was Jonathan holding his mother's ministry to the very standard her ministry had publicly demanded of everyone else. What do you think? Was Jonathan right to object? Or was this grief disguised as theology? The answer matters more than it might initially seem. Joni's response, or rather the institution's response, was swift, and depending on your perspective, either decisive or ruthless. In November 2023, Daystar's board convened. They presented Jonathan with a choice: sign a non-disclosure agreement and remain, or refuse and be removed. No middle ground. No extended conversation. Sign or go. Jonathan refused. Then, on November 15, 2024, journalist Julie Roys, who had built her career exposing financial and ethical misconduct within Christian institutions, contacted Daystar with questions about Jonathan's allegations. The timeline of what followed is not subtle. The very next day, Jonathan Lamb was terminated. One day, one inquiry from one journalist, one son gone. But the termination was not the deepest wound. It was not even close. Jonathan and his wife Susie had alleged something far more serious than a theological disagreement over remarriage. They alleged that a child in their family had been sexually abused by a family member. The named individual denied the allegation. Daystar conducted an internal investigation and concluded there was insufficient evidence. The Colleyville Police Department investigated and, in May 2025, archived the case. Insufficient evidence. Precision matters enormously here. These allegations were investigated. The investigation found insufficient evidence to substantiate them. They were not proven. They remain allegations, serious, painful, and legally unresolved. What is documented and what is not an allegation is the institutional response to the family that raised them. Jonathan and Susie Lamb also alleged spiritual abuse. They alleged that Pastor Jimmy Evans, a Daystar ally and significant figure within the network's orbit, had told Jonathan directly that his mother was the voice of God within Daystar, and that to challenge Joni was to challenge divine authority. Jonathan rejected that framing. Susie described the environment as one of coercive spiritual control. Evans has not publicly addressed these specific characterizations. Daystar has not substantively responded to them. What the institution did instead was manage, contain, and silence through contract. And when the contract was refused, terminate. And then Joni died. May 7, 2026. Susie Lamb, Jonathan's wife, the woman who had watched her husband lose his family, his job, his inheritance, everything, told those close to her that she had been holding on to hope, that even in the final weeks, she believed reconciliation was still possible, that somehow, before the end, the breach would heal. She found out Joni was gone the same way strangers did. Sit with that for a moment. A daughter-in-law, estranged, still hoping for a miracle, learning from public sources that the miracle was no longer possible. Jonathan, for his part, posted a photograph after his mother's death. Not a statement, not an accusation. A photograph from his childhood, himself small between his parents. Marcus on one side, Joni on the other. A family that, for one frozen moment, was still whole. Whatever Jonathan Lamb feels about everything that followed, the allegations, the NDA, the termination, the silence at the end, he reached for that image. That specific image. The one where none of it had happened yet. This is the story that Daystar's 19-word statement was designed to foreclose. Not the cancer, not the real estate, not the private jet. This, a family that built a ministry on redemption and could not redeem itself. A mother who sat beside her husband on live television and called forgiveness a divine instruction, and died estranged from her son. An institution that preaches vulnerability every single day of the broadcast week and responded to its own internal crisis with non-disclosure agreements and next-day terminations. None of the allegations against any individual in this story have been legally proven. That distinction is real and it matters. But the rupture itself, the estrangement, the son who found out from the news, those are not allegations. Those are facts. And they are the ones Daystar would most prefer you never think about. Every life, at its end, becomes a question of inheritance. Not the legal kind, not the real estate portfolios, not the estimated $40 million, not the Gulfront condominium, not the Colleyville estate, not the properties still being cataloged in Georgia and South Carolina. That inheritance will be distributed, disputed, or dissolved in ways that courts and attorneys will eventually determine. The deeper inheritance is harder to divide. It is the inheritance of meaning, the inheritance of legacy, the story that gets told, and more importantly, the story that gets controlled after the final breath. And here, at the end of Joni Lamb's life, that battle has already begun. What Daystar will tell you is this, and it is not dishonest. Even in her final months, even as the metastatic bone cancer moved through her body, even as the back injury accelerated a deterioration she could no longer conceal from herself, she worked. She helped assemble an executive leadership team. She worked with the board to ensure that when she was gone, the machine would not stop, that the programming would continue uninterrupted, that the 2.3 billion households currently receiving Daystar signal would wake up the morning after her death and find the network exactly where they left it. And they did. The network did not miss a beat. The programming continued. The signal held. By any operational measure, that is extraordinary. It is the mark of a true institution builder, someone who understood that the work was never about her, that what she was constructing had to outlast her, that legacy without infrastructure is merely sentiment. Joni Lamb was never just sentiment. She is survived by 3 children, Rachel Lamb, Rebecca Lamb Weiss, and Jonathan, the son who was terminated the day after a journalist called, the son who signed no non-disclosure agreement, the son who learned his mother was gone from a news source rather than a family member, the son who responded not with a statement, not with a lawsuit, but with a childhood photograph. The distribution of a $40 million estate among those 3 children, particularly given the estrangement, the termination, the allegations, and the institutional walls Daystar constructed around itself during Jonathan's final year of employment has not been publicly confirmed. No succession plan has been announced. No timeline for resolution has been offered. What that silence means depends entirely on who you ask. Here is the legacy that Joni Lamb's allies will offer you. And it is not dishonest. She built something from nothing. A girl from Colleyville, Texas, who grew up to place her voice in 2.3 billion homes. She co-founded a network that genuinely transformed the landscape of Christian broadcasting. She hosted a talk show for 4 decades. 4 decades. In an industry that discards people seasonally, that consumes talent and produces nostalgia. She won awards. She published books. She outlasted trends, outlasted formats, outlasted everyone who predicted the audience would move on. She stood beside her husband on live television during the worst moment of their marriage. Whatever you think of the theology she used to justify that choice, the courage required to absorb public humiliation and remain upright, visible, and unbroken was real. She rebuilt after he died. A new partnership, a new chapter, a woman in her 60s, still moving forward, still building. That is not nothing. In its own way, it is remarkable. But here is the legacy that the full picture also demands you hold. A son estranged. A daughter-in-law who sat in quiet hope waiting for a reconciliation that never arrived, and who learned that hope was finished from a stranger's news feed. A family that spent its public life proclaiming the transformative power of forgiveness and could not find its way to forgiveness when forgiveness was hardest. An institution that responded to internal pain with non-disclosure agreements instead of conversation. A woman who understood better than almost anyone that the stories we tell about ourselves are the most powerful things we possess, and who, in the end, could not control this one. Does that diminish what she built? Or does it simply make her human? A flawed, complicated, driven human being who achieved extraordinary things and left behind an extraordinary mess, like almost every person who has ever built anything that truly mattered. That is the question Joni Lamb leaves you with. Not the cancer, not the real estate, not the private jet, the NDA, or the termination letter delivered the morning after a journalist called. Who gets to decide what a life meant? Is it the institution that survives her, polished and uninterrupted? Is it the son who reaches for a childhood photograph instead of a press statement? Is it the 2.3 billion households who knew only the version she chose to broadcast? Or does the answer live somewhere in the impossible distance between all of them, in the gap between the woman Joni Lamb was in front of the camera and the woman she was when the cameras went dark? She built her life on the belief that truth spoken aloud could heal. She died keeping her own truth silent. And now the truth is out. Not all of it. Not neatly. Not in the version anyone would have chosen. But out, moving through the world the way truth always does, past the boundaries of what any institution can contain. If this story raised questions you did not expect about faith, about family, about the price of building something larger than yourself, leave them in the comments. What surprised you most about Joni Lamb's story? That is the conversation this video exists to begin. And if you stayed with this story from beginning to end, through everything it uncovered, you already know we do not tell these stories the way everyone else does. Subscribe because the next one goes just as deep. Joni Lamb, 65 years old, builder, broadcaster, a woman who taught millions to speak and kept her own most important secrets until the very end.